The following program is brought to you free of charge by the sponsorship of Novus Ordo Watch. See for yourself that the Church of the Second Vatican Council is not in fact the Catholic Church of the ages. Go to novusordowatch.org. That's novusordowatch.org.
Welcome to Clerical Conversations on the Crisis, our inaugural show. Today we are going to be joined by His Excellency Bishop Daniel Dolan, His Excellency Bishop Donald Sanborn, and Father Anthony Cekada as we discuss the 30 years that have passed since the 1983 expulsion of 9 priests from the Society of St. Pius X. So Bishop Dolan, Bishop Sanborn, and Father Cekada, thank you for joining us.
You're very welcome. Yeah, very welcome.
Nice to be here. Thank you.
Well, I suppose we should probably start at the beginning of the 1970 founding of the SSPX as a pious union. I think it's important to note that the society did not ever start as a large religious organization in the way we might think of the Cistercians or the Benedictines, but it was more like a loose confederation. And I think, Father Cekada, you wrote a little bit about the legal foundations of the society. I think it's important to note this from the beginning so we understand the spirit of collaboration that was part of what was going on.
Well, initially the society was founded as what's called a pious union, and that's an entity in canon law that it can be clerical or it can be a lay union. And the purpose of an organization like this is sometimes to promote public worship, sometimes to promote a devotion such as the Rosary, sometimes to promote charity and almsgiving. That would be, for instance, like the St. Vincent de Paul Society. So the Society of St. Pius X was first called the Fraternity of the Apostles of Jesus and Mary. And it obtained recognition from from the Bishop of Freiburg as a pious union. And one of the goals of it was to, in line, I believe, with one of the provisions of Vatican II, was to help spread priests throughout the world. So it was initially envisioned in canon law and founded as a rather simple organization. As I say, somewhat the level of a Rosary Confraternity or the Vincent de Paul Society.
Well, when we look at it that way, I'm sure that you and Bishop Dolan and Bishop Sanborn didn't go to a cone with the idea that we're only going to join a religious organization if it's erected in the way of a traditional religious congregation or religious order. You were looking for a way to combat modernism and to find a traditional Catholic priesthood. Is that fair?
Oh yes. I mean that was certainly the case, that we were looking for a traditional seminary with traditional formation in order to be traditional, that is to say, true Catholic priests, and anything else would just be sort of a vehicle or a means towards that end.
Yes, at the time too, you were so desperate that you really didn't care what it was, as long as it was traditional. You were so happy to get out from under the horrors of the modernist seminary that you didn't give a lot of thought to what it was. You just assumed that it was a group of people who were organizing to make a traditional priesthood.
And Archbishop Lefebvre himself recognized this. I remember him saying in a conference once that, I realized that most of you gentlemen would not be here if we didn't experience this crisis in the church. Yeah, and he said some of you
Benedictines, Dominicans, diocesan. Sure, yeah.
So it wasn't really.
Go ahead.
It wasn't something that was really in the forefront of our minds as joining this special religious order we felt a calling to.
Right. Yeah. But I had decided not to become a priest. I had left the Novus Ordo Seminary, and I thought, well, that's that. When I heard through a priest that used to say the Latin Mass in Detroit about Archbishop Lefebvre and his seminary, and I decided to go over for that. So it was simply that. It was simply in order to be a Catholic priest, because the other way was not Catholic. So that was pretty clear from the very beginning for all of us.
Yeah. Well, Bishop Dolan, did you find your traditional Catholic formation at Ecole?
Well, yes and no. There were, I guess you could use the Happy Meal analogy. There were elements of Catholic formation, and then there were other elements that were sort of lacking in substantial anchorage. So really, it was a very sort of a confused. It was a confusing time, I suppose, and it was a very confused offering that Archbishop Lefebvre presented. It was hardly the glowing city on the hillside, I tell you what, and then anyone who lived through that era could certainly give good examples of that. What do you remember, Bishop Sambor?
Yes, it was a mixed bag. I would say it was something that resembled a seminary perhaps of 1963 or 64. There were elements of the traditional, and there were elements of the new. For example, they used 4 missals to say a low mass, because the priest started at the altar, and then he said the introit at the Cedilla, which was typical of the coming Novus Ordo, or then it was already in vigor. Then they moved over to a pulpit and read they said the introit at the Cedilla. The epistle they read to the people at a pulpit, and then they crossed over to another pulpit and read the gospel toward the people, and then he finally ended up back at the altar where he used the 4th missal, and there they left out the last gospel, and they actually put up only 2 altar cards because they weren't saying the last gospel, so it looked rather odd. So you had this hybrid traditional mass. It was not a John the 23rd traditional mass. You would never have recognized it. It was a 1964-65 version of the traditional mass, but it was in Latin, and so you always held out a certain hope that things would get better. You realized that this was imperfect, but you hoped that things would get better. So that's the. That was my impression of it at the beginning. But you were so happy to have anything besides what was going on in those modernist seminaries that you would take practically anything.
Well, I mean,
I remember.
He had the Latin Novus Ordo, so I mean, that was probably the best you could get, right?
The Latin Novus Ordo, I never saw. Maybe once. It was a rare bird. Nobody ever said it, at least in my my experience.
Yeah, the monastery I was in had the Latin Novus Ordo, done in a very, very restrained way with ceremony and so on, and lots of Gregorian chant. And they had communion in the hand, though, along with it, which was extremely strange. So I thought when I was going over to a cone that I would see, the traditional Mass in all of its glory, but it was sort of a mixed bag. As far as some of the courses went, for instance, the moral theology course was absolutely excellent, but I remember the scripture course was, one of the scripture courses, the introductory course, was actually virtually the same thing that I had gotten in the Modernist Seminary in Milwaukee. So it was a mixed bag in any event. But we were there because it was better than what we had come from.
Yes.
Yeah, I remember thinking to myself when I arrived, January of 73, finally the traditional Mass, will this ever be glorious? And I remember how bitterly disappointed I was when I saw this odd affair that they had, which I had lived through in my parish church just a few years before, and it was very sad to see the same thing instead of the full traditional Mass as it should be offered. And then, Father Cekada, at this point, why don't you tell them that about the traditional scripture, about the scripture course, how you went to see the director of the seminary?
Oh, yes. So I went to see the director of the seminary to complain to him. It was the Canon Berthaud, who is actually a very good moral theology teacher. And I went to him and I said that the introductory course to Scripture that you're giving me is, or that I'm being given by this priest is modernist. It's the same course that I got in the modernist seminary. And so he scratched his head a little bit and he said, okay, we'll dispense you from it then because you've had it already.
That's so typical of the Acon spirit. And then, Bishop Sambor, this might be a good time for you to talk about. I remember when I first got there, the seminary was in an uproar because of the rector being the Abbé Masson, and there was actually a novena going on against him. And I'm thinking to myself, dial back years, 40 years later, it's the same thing with Follet, right? Nothing has really changed.
Yes, again, it's it all boils down to their stance vis-a-vis the Novus Ordo.
Yes.
That undefined position and how much we're going to be with them or against them. And and Father Masson at the time was too much with them and had liberal ideas, and there was this house uprising and pressure put on Archbishop Lefebvre to sack him, which happened, and so that has been the history of that organization. As I said in my last newsletter, it's a 40-year-old opera buffa. It's a comic opera where people cannot and will not decide what their position is with regard to the new religion, and so it'll go on for another 40 years.
Well, you all managed to make your way through in any event and become ordained, and I think it's important for people to know that there wasn't the issue with sedevacantism that there is now in the society, that Bishop Dolan was always known as the time, the seminarian, known as Daniel Dolan was a known sedevacantist. What was the attitude towards sedevacantism in the seminary, and how is that different from how the society deals with it today?
Well, I think you could say that at the beginning, that is to say after the first suppression by the Vatican during the reign of Paul VI, that actually you were viewed as being on the Archbishop's side and loyal to Lefebvre if you were a sedevacantist, and it was certainly well received. Bishop Sambon would say this just be an excellent example of the classic zigzag. But at a certain, for a few years there, until the famous bear hug of JP2 with Lefebvre at the Vatican, which changed everything. But until then, that was not only an acceptable position, but it was viewed with a certain amount of favor.
Yes. I remember then Father Gaillard de Laurier, and I believe it was in 1973 or 74, but as I recall, it was before the suppression of 74, that he gave a conference about it. It was by invitation only, but it was not secret. He gave a conference. It was presenting his thesis concerning the vacancy of the see. And there were seminarians with whom you spoke that were sedevacantists. You didn't keep it a secret. It was not something that you whispered. It's just that was what you held, and nobody really said anything about it.
It wasn't really even known by the name sedevacantism at that point. That's only something that actually came up in the 80s, that you just believed that Paul VI was not a Catholic and was a false pope.
Yeah.
And that was that.
Right, and the first priest ordained by Archbishop Lefebvre, an Anglican convert, Peter Morgan, he was certainly well known for promoting that, as was Father Barbara, who at that time, the noted French traditionalist leader, was a friend of Archbishop Lefebvre and was well received at Acon in the first years. He too. So there, it's the same thing as the liturgical questions. There was for years. There's absolutely no controversy about it. In fact, I can remember at the first little German seminary in Wiesbaden in Switzerland, I can remember Father Schmidberger making sort of philo-sedevacantist comments about how they had taken down or covered up the picture of Paul VI, and that's typical.
Yes, well, I remember the first day that Father Schmidberger arrived with. Here's the. Excuse me, Argentine Cardinal Bergoglio has been elected the anti-pope. So,
Bergoglio.
Yes. But anyway, but I remember they both Fathers Votsa and then seminarians and Schmidberger were open sedevacantists. I remember having a discussion with him the day he arrived, and they were very, very clear about their being sedevacantists, and that was in 1972. So there was no controversy about it. It was just something that you could say, and although you didn't make a big scene out of it either.
Yeah.
Well, and so you all made it without being expelled for sedevacantism, and one by one make it back to the United States. I think the then Father Dolan was probably a bit too dangerous to send to America, so I think he was banished to England.
So actually, I requested to go to England because my priest hero, Father Morgan, was there, and I thought this would be the place to go. So I went there, and I spent a few months there working in England. So, and because as I say, there wasn't any controversy about anything like that, any more than there was about the liturgical questions. So, in other words, like what should be emerging for our listeners, Stephen, at this point, is that the picture is not at all what you think. So, what was Écône like in the early 70s when we went there? Well, it was confused. There were modernist forces and traditionalist forces battling, you might say. Archbishop Lefebvre was a diplomat sometimes, and then sometimes more strident, shall we say, like the Lille Mass is a good example of that. And then, as regards to liturgy, it was the same thing. These different traditions were certainly accepted. None of these things were controversies at that time. And if anything, to be a quote-unquote hardliner, put you on the side of Archbishop Lefebvre from at least 4 years, maybe 74 to
78. Yeah, 74. You were on the good side. Yes.
We were on, and we were. Sometimes indeed we would bask in his approval, and then other times when the winds changed from the Vatican, then not so much.
Well, sure. When he said something like, "We have nothing to do with the conciliar church, which is a schismatic church, which has nothing to do with Catholicism," I'm sure you all were doing fine.
That's right. We were good with that, as they would say today.
Yeah. Yes. Yes.
Well, of course, as we're listening to the show, we're getting a lot of news reports that are coming in from the latest claimant to the papacy since Vatican II, who's apparently going to take the name Francis. But we'll be doing a show on that hopefully soon. I've been keeping His Excellency Bishop Sanborn and Father Cekada quite busy with interviews over the last few days, so we'll get to that when we can. But you
don't think they staged the announcement to draw people away from the show, do you, Stephen?
Upstage us. I think that's very likely.
I'm going to file that under my Trad Conspiracies hat.
Very good.
So in any event, all of you managed to be ordained, despite your great sin of sedevacantism, and you all go to your different apostolates. Bishop Dolan, you went to England, and Father Cekada and then Father Sanborn went back to America to bring the faith to the colonies. And I think it's important to note two things when we're looking at this situation. One, everyone that I've talked to from the Nine has expressed that they came here with the intent to gain ground for the Catholic faith for our Lord Jesus Christ. It was not to gain territory or gain ground for the Society of St. Pius X. Obviously, they could be one and the same as long as they were working in the same interest. The second, as they were establishing houses, much like you described the seminary atmosphere in a cone as not always consistent, sometimes confused, subject to all kinds of forces, you throw in legal issues around owning chapels and faithful who had been run out of their parishes and are now trying to create their own places of survival. There wasn't a consistent policy, and I'm sure Father Cekada, as bursar, you can speak to this issue, but I'd be interested in Bishop Dolan's take on how this was in England, because I know there were lots of lay people involved there.
Well, the English were impeccable because they had all been properly trained by Father Morgan. So they lived the way actually a lot of our faithful lived in our chapels. That is to say, well, we're just Catholics, and we don't have anything to do with this new conciliar church. And of course, we have the old Mass without any changes. And that's what you found in England. It was delightful. And that's, in effect, what we were able to do in our chapel. There wasn't any controversy. Every now and again, of course, there was some. That's how Archbishop Lefebvre got all the letters denouncing me. But usually everybody, that's because, why did they come? They wanted the true faith. They wanted the true Mass. And that's what we did. That's what we did.
As regards the way things developed in the society, what you have to be wary of, I think, when you look back at history, is sort of anachronism. And you kind of project back, people project back to those beginning days, the idea of the Society of St. Pius X that they have now, like this worldwide empire and this big brand with all of these properties and institutions, etc. It really wasn't like that at all in the beginning. And as far as whatever, as far as how we lived and how property was to be held, there was never any consistent policy on that. In the beginning, the Archbishop, at least in the United States, was interested in having laymen actually own the property. In fact, that's how a cone was owned. It was owned by 3 Swiss laymen because he was afraid that the priests would be subject, say, to pressure from the diocesan bishop to turn the property over the diocese. So there's several different types of policies when it came to property. And as far as having chapels, that was not initially envisioned, certainly not in any of the rules of the society. It was more envisioned that you would go into Novus Ordo churches where you were wanted and then offer the Mass there, or go and function in a diocesan seminary. So there are no real clear rules or guidelines, anything like that.
The work that we did was the work that was done sort of automatically by good priests in France, say, the old priests Mass centers, and was done by Father Morgan in England. That work was not spearheaded, directed, or inspired in any sense by Archbishop Lefebvre. He was still hanging on to the idea of maybe connecting with some bishops, and I remember a conference towards the end of the school year in 73 or 74, must have been 73, about sending us as seminary professors someplace. And I remember thinking, well, now that's funny, because there you have Father Morgan with all these Mass centers. Shouldn't we be doing that work? So once again, there was always this tension, sort of 2 different approaches, but it was the work of the Mass centers was just sort of spontaneous work on the part of Catholic priests. It wasn't anything inspired by the Pius X Society.
Yes, that's true. I remember that. There was no talk of going out and founding what would be renegade Mass centers.
Right.
But he did tell Father Kelly in 1973 to go and say Mass on Long Island. So he evolved as the situation evolved, and so. But there was no set policy, and he then Father Kelly said Mass in his brother's garage. I remember it. I went to Mass there as a seminarian. And then they acquired a house later on in East Meadow, and that was in the name of the New York Friends of the Fraternity of Pius X or something like that, and that was controlled by lay people.
No.
So there was no set policy about anything. The whole thing evolved and also flip-flopped as it went along, according to circumstances and pressures. And,
yes, because at one point we had wanted to, because traditionalist priests in different parts of the country had difficulty with lay boards of directors controlling chapels. We proposed that instead we priests would control the corporations that own the chapels. So that I think we did for a while, and then at a certain point at about 1980, then Archbishop Lefebvre changed the policy on us again and said that he didn't want this anymore. And there were churches in 3 places, one in Michigan, in Iowa, and in another one in Pennsylvania, where the lay people wanted to get churches, and we had to tell them that, no, we can't have anything to do with it. Now you have to get them because the policy has changed. So it went back and forth.
Yeah.
So that I guess, where are we, Your Excellency, Father, where would we say we are? We're at 1978, we're right before the election of John Paul II.
Yes,
that we're going through these issues. And what happened, for those who don't know, what happened with John Paul II that changed things for the society?
The bear hug.
The bear hug, yeah.
Sure. That changed everything. He went to Rome shortly after the election, and John Paul II gave him a big hug, typical of John Paul II. And there they discussed the whole thing, and John Paul II tried to be very fatherly to him, and there was hatched the formula of accepting the council in the light of tradition, and it was hatched by John Paul II. And so Archbishop Lefebvre latched on to that very much. This is the key, that we can accept the council in light of tradition, that is, give it a hermeneutic of continuity, essentially, give it a spin. That's the only thing you could call it, a spin, saying something that it really didn't say, but we can understand it or have it that way. That's what everyone really meant by it, or at least that's what Archbishop Lefebvre meant by it. And so that became the banner of the Society of St. Pius X, accepting the council in the light of tradition. And then there was this great movement started to reconcile with the modernists and to regain the approval of the modernist hierarchy for the Society of St. Pius X. Now, a curious thing that happened in this time, just as a footnote, is that after the suppression took place, the Archbishop Lefebvre decided that the society graduated from a pious union, the way it was founded and recognized by the Diocese of Fribourg, and graduated to a congregation of priests without vows, which is a big step up, even though it was a suppressed congregation. That happened in 1977. I remember getting the papers in the mail. We just got these papers saying, well, by the way, we are, and I thought, that's interesting. And that's just the part of the evolution of this thing. So he obviously wanted to do that in order to have the Vatican recognize it as a more than a pious union, and to get it recognized as something like that. So but in 1978, that's when everything changed, and then the liberals were the good guys, and the Sedevacantists were the most evil creatures that walked upon the earth, and anybody that expressed any kind of hard line with regard to the modernists, short of Sedevacantism, he was held in disrepute.
Yes, and this had happened rather quickly because shortly in August of the same year we were having dinner at Oyster Bay with Archbishop Lefebvre, myself and a number of other priests, and I was going to press him a little bit on the Pope question, and this was before really before the election of JP2. And so I brought up the question of religious liberty, and I said, "Is it heresy?" And then he said, "Yes, of course it is." And then I said, "Well, how does that affect the question of the Pope? Doesn't it mean that a heretic cannot be Pope?" And then he said, very famously in French, "I don't say that the Pope is not the Pope, but I don't say that you cannot say that the Pope is not the Pope." Bishop Sanborn could give us that in French. So he even laughed because it sounds very amusing in French.
There's a lot of peas in it.
A lot of
Peter
peas
Piper
in it.
picked the peck of pickled peas.
And we all laughed. And we thought this was great, but then he soon got the bear hug, and everything changed.
But this all illustrates exactly the personality of Archbishop Lefebvre and the whole history of the society. That is to say, in a sense, all of the politics here are personal. And the dynamic, he was a very diplomatic man and also someone who wanted to please his audience. So if he was with us, he would take a slightly more hard line, and if he was in the Vatican, he would be slightly more agreeable. And he always, as a diplomat, he would always try to continue that balancing act. But I wanted to mention, too, Bishop Sanborn says, very interesting. All of a sudden, we became a society of priests without vows. We also found ourselves to be a society of priests without any rights. And that too, has never changed all these years. You have, as Padre Cekada says, the only right you have in the society is the Miranda, right? You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a kangaroo court. And that has never, ever, ever changed. That says those are some of the great truths. There's no such thing as canon law. There's no such thing as that balance, the right of priests. The society, back to the time of Archbishop Lefebvre, never, so for a supposedly priestess society, took any care for its members who were sick, maybe mentally ill or a breakdown, anything like that. No, they were always just thrown out. They were never taken care of. And if you objected to the policy of the day, you too would be thrown out. And that has never changed. That's going on still today. So it's not a priestly society, it's an anti-priestly society. Actually, if you look at it that sense, what you do to one of these, my least brethren, you do unto me. Wow, how sad. How sad. Yeah, this is all part of a balanced viewpoint of Lefebvre.
The idea that it turned into a society of the common life without vows, to me, was something that was absurd, because I had been in the Cistercian order for 2 years, and we had 2 years of courses 2 years actually of studying of the canon law and the rights of religious and the obligations of religious, and all of these things. The order was run according to a whole book full of rules, and all of the prescriptions of canon law were followed, and you had certain rights, you had certain obligations, and this was hundreds of pages of stuff, and you had nothing like that in the Society of St. Pius X. You had 20 pages of type stuff, double-spaced, and that was it. And you had, as Bishop Dolan said, in effect, the superiors had no obligation whatsoever towards you. That has not changed, and you can see that in the fate of the latest 3 priests in France of the Society of St. Pius X, that they are on the way out, and there's nothing
that was
they
a forgery, Father. That was a conspiracy.
Oh yeah,
that
that's
right.
I should also point out that at this point, the organization becomes truly Lefebvrist. That there has been so much zigzagging and doctrinal change that it's clear that the only survivors in it will be those who are so personally attached to Archbishop Lefebvre that they will change their minds as he changes his mind and go in whatever direction he leads them, no matter if that direction should be completely opposite of what was yesterday, doctrinally and liturgically or whatever it is. and that principle was out the door. That really crystallized at this point. That if you were to be a survivor, you had to be a Lefebvrist.
That sounds very familiar, Excellency. That sounds like an article that was written some time ago called "The Mountains of Gilboa," which you can find at traditionalmass.org. I will post that on Twitter. And for those of you who are just joining us, you are listening to Clerical Conversations on the Crisis. Our guests today are His Excellency Bishop Daniel Dolan, His Excellency Bishop Donald Sanborn, and Father Anthony Cekada. And we're talking about the split in 1983, the expulsion of 9 American priests from the Northeast District of the Society of St. Pius X. And we have 3 of the culprits with us today discussing what happened then and reflections 30 years on. I think we're up to, let's say, 1980, Your Excellencies and Father, and the imposition of, let's say, an unofficial or official don't ask, don't tell policy on sedevacantism. Is that fair?
Yes, that was it.
That's essentially it, yeah.
Well, that developed in 1980 when there was, in 1979, the letter went out, and I remember receiving it, that the society cannot bear to have within its bosom anyone that says that John Paul II is not the Pope and will not mention him in the canon. And then the guillotine was brought out with that if you don't mention him in the canon, you're out of the society, with that same due process of law that Father, I'm being sarcastic, that Father Cekada mentioned, or Father Bishop Dolan. So there were a number of expulsions in France, Father Guépin, Father Belmont, and these were high-profile people. They had been at Écône since day one. And although, there were not a great many expulsions, for that time it was quite a bit, because they had, maybe a total less than 100 priests at the time. There were 4 or 5 expulsions in France, and it became clear that the same was going to be done over here. Well, Archbishop Lefebvre came over in the spring of 1980, and in a meeting in which it was expected that the sedevacantist priests would be kicked out, they came to a don't ask, don't tell agreement, whereby if you keep your mouth shut about what you're doing and you don't spread it around that you are not mentioning him in the canon, then you can stay in the Society of St. Pius X.
And how it happened, that really illustrates the reality of Archbishop Lefebvre's society. It's all about Lefebvre. So he came to the Priory in Long Island on a May evening, and we had organized May devotions with benediction, and he saw that, and he was edified by that, and also the fact that the people heard that the Archbishop was coming, so the people came. So then he thinks to himself 2 things, I'm thinking. They're not so bad. Look, these priests, they're pious, and they haven't turned the people against me. Look at all their people who have come out to see me. So again, it's something personal. And he's thinking to himself, well, just as he made an arrangement on the one hand with John Paul II, he could make an arrangement with the sedevacantist on the other side. And so I think the first night he had intended to expel us, and then the next morning after breakfast he proposes a deal.
Yep.
And it's a deal based on don't ask, don't tell, and you'll be quiet and discreet, and we'll make this work.
So is the lesson that you're supposed to sleep on it or have the meatloaf, or?
Well, the meatloaf came later, but it was the sleep-on thing. He slept on it because he did, because I think everybody was so friendly, and that took him aback. And since it's all about Lefebvre, well, everyone was friendly to Lefebvre, and so why not make a deal?
But that's a very important point. Excuse me. That question was settled in 1980.
Yes.
And there was no question of that in 1983, and the Society mendaciously said that this is the reason why they're leaving.
Yes.
In 1983, that was a lie.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
That had all been settled.
Yeah.
Well, so it was settled in 1980. So shall we say there was a period of peace granted to the world at this time, and you you were able to operate the new seminary in Ridgefield that you had helped get up and running. You were telling the Archbishop about a possible property out in Minnesota.
Well, that was 1981. You see, 1980 was a very stormy visit. Then in the spring of 81 he came, and I was in the process of launching the fundraising for the extension of the seminary in Ridgefield. And we went out to do the dedication of the church in Minnesota, and I said to him, by the way, there's a building in Winona, Minnesota that has just come up, and you might want to consider that instead of building. Building is very expensive and troublesome. Well, he lashed out at me in the car, I remember it, and he said, you're never happy, and he just wanted, I just kept my mouth shut after that. And ironically, that's exactly what they did. They did not build in Ridgefield, Connecticut. They went out to Winona, Minnesota. So but the 1981 visit overall went very well because the tensions were down until right at the end, when I was about to drive him to the airport, he told me that it would be necessary to accept the John the 23rd breviary and missal in the seminary. And so I thought, oh no. And so we had this big discussion on the way to LaGuardia Airport about the John the 23rd Missal and Breviary. And little did I know at the time, but this was in preparation for the reconciliation with the modernists. I found that out the following year, in 1982. And but this was preparing the society for pleasing the modernists.
Can I ask Bishop Dolan what was going on in England in 1981?
Oh, I was back already.
Okay.
So I was actually back in late January of 1977.
So were there any rumblings like this going on over there at the time? So was it just an American issue?
I
don't know.
Father Morgan was being replaced by Father Black, and it was the same thing of the society exerting legal control over the properties, and certain changes that were being enforced. And there was certainly grumbling and rumbling, but probably the English were just keeping a stiff upper lip and being English and drinking more tea and things. So they were dealing with it somehow. I don't think it was.
There's not too much that happens in England. I mean,
it
has never been an active place for the traditional movement.
Because you got to speak in low tones anyways, so you don't get overheard. So, I wanted to mention about the 81 Minnesota visit. My memory, from a liturgical point of view, that he was dedicating Archbishop Lefebvre was dedicating our church in St. Paul, Saints Processus and Martinian, in May of that year, and the prequel, if you will, to this idea that from now on they would have to accept the new missal and breviary of John the 23rd was that about a quarter of the way through the dedication ceremony of the church, he got annoyed at me and demanded his little traveling John the 23rd pontifical that he had in his suitcase. So I went in and I got it for him. And then at that point, I just gave up because John the 23rd had elaborated a new sort of a hybrid dedication of a church with elements of the consecration of a church, a much more solemn and long-lasting ceremony. And he kind of just conducted that himself then. After that, I thought, well, you're on your own, because I had no idea what was going on then. And then soon thereafter, within a day or two, he announces to then Father Sanborn, this is what you'll be doing from now on.
Yes. So now I thought it was contained only in the seminary. I thought he wanted the John the 23rd only in the seminary. So the following year, in 1982, when he came, I said to him, I'm going to resign as rector of the seminary because I really can't live with this. And I can't put this through. This is just something I cannot do. And so he was on notice that I just couldn't do this. So in the fall of that year, after the chapter meeting of 1982, he is assigned Bishop Williamson as the vice rector, with the view that I would go out and he would come in as the rector, which was fine with me in the sense that that was the decision I made, and that was what I was going to do. The thought was, though, that he was not going to impose it on the churches and the parishes, and that we could continue as we were in the parishes. Now, if I had known that he had the intention of imposing it in the parishes, then I think I would have acted differently in the whole thing.
And we didn't realize it at the time, but we learned in 1983 that, in fact, he had been carrying on negotiations with the Vatican to make some sort of a deal, and had been corresponding with them, and this was all of this seemed to be sort of a part of the plan, that you have that he would present to them some sort of an idea that the whole organization has a unified liturgy, and also there was the legal question, I think, in retrospect, of the control of all the properties. Then at that point, this became very important. They started asking questions about that, even though in 1980 he had an entirely different policy. I think that it was in view of perhaps being able to tell the Vatican that, we can wrap all of this up in one big package that I control for you, with one organization under all of the same rules, all owning the same properties, so there are no more divisions or competition for your diocesan churches, with the same liturgical rights.
Yes, we learned it. We learned that these negotiations were going on with the then Cardinal Ratzinger in 1983, because one of the 9 priests was doubtful about whether he should leave or not, and was talking to Bishop Williamson and others, then Father Williamson and others, that in doubt as to whether he should leave. And he was invited out of the seminary, which was then in turmoil, and he was given confidentially all of the correspondence between Archbishop Lefebvre and Cardinal Ratzinger in view of a reconciliation with the modernists. And the message was, stick with us because we're going places. We're going to get fixed up by the new religion, and this is a dead end street. What you're thinking about. So there was actually it's odd that Bishop Williamson should be on the other side now, but at the time he was putting out bait, so to speak, of a modern reconciliation with the modernists in 1983. But that had started in 1982. And in the course of that visit in 1982, Archbishop Lefebvre had me translate a conference for him to the seminarians in which he explained that it was necessary to take the John the 23rd liturgy because the Vatican would never accept us if we had the pre-1955 liturgy. Mm. So we see, it's very clear that it was a preparation for a modern reconciliation with the modernists. Now, those negotiations broke down at a certain point, but then they were restarted again, even after Assisi, which is 1986, in which Archbishop Lefebvre brushed with sedevacantism in his declaration with Bishop de Castromayor. But they started up again, and they, as you know, in May of 1988, Archbishop Lefebvre signs the protocol, which is an abominable document in which he gave away effectively the whole store to the modernists, and the next day he repudiated it. That everyone knows that story of Archbishop Lefebvre. So, but that's so. The John the 23rd, the use of the John the 23rd rubrics and liturgy was very much part of this whole idea to reconcile with the modernists. It should also be pointed out that they don't use the John the 23rd in the sense that they still say the Confiteor before communion, which he suppressed. So there's no idea of obeying the Holy Father. It's just what Archbishop Lefebvre wanted. That's the bottom line. It's what he wanted. They accused us in rejecting the John the 23rd liturgy of not obeying the Holy Father. And in fact, they didn't either.
No, of course
they did not take his, the commands, and they never did. They had no sense of saying, well, this is the date that we will stick to and go by these rules. They never had that. It's what Archbishop Lefebvre wanted.
I brought that up to His Excellency during our expulsion conference, and I'm afraid he was someplace between shocked and really insulted that I dared to tell him. But I said, "You don't have the authority to set the rules for the sacred liturgy. Only Rome can do that." And he was really insulted that I mentioned that to him. But that happens to be true, and of course that's one of the big problems, isn't it? But I wanted to jump in here and say something about, we were talking before about the preparations, say between AD 81 and then our expulsion a few years later, the preparations for that. It wasn't, and our listeners must not think that it was purely liturgical, some sort of a battle about recondite battle about certain liturgical books or not. It was. It had to do with Catholic morality. What really sparked it was this: that I had, as a mission coordinator out in the West, a man who had a conciliar marriage annulment, and then Father Kelly, to his credit, insisted with me that I bring the matter up to him, and I was reluctant to do it at the beginning, I remember, because I knew this was just going to be a mess. But I did bring it up to him. The man wrote to the Pius X headquarters. Who would that have been, Bishop Sanborn? Did he wrote to?
He wrote to the Archbishop and
to the Archbishop.
Father Patrice LaRoche,
answered
General
him,
Secretary.
right.
He answered in the Archbishop's name.
Yeah, and then as to saying that you can certainly live in good conscience with your second wife. Those annulments are absolutely valid. That's an act of the Church, and don't worry about it. That's what scared us. The practical, they were preparing for the practical, in the Conciliar Church they would say pastoral, implications of this embrace of the Church of Vatican II, of the Church of the Revolution. And so now we're going to accept the conciliar annulments too, I guess. And that was certainly Lefebvre's policy that came from his Secretary General.
Another thing to bring up in that regard is that there was also the question of the new rites of ordination, the Vatican II rites of ordination. When I had gone to Icona as a seminarian, I had held up some hopes of converting some of my friends who were still in the Novus Ordo seminaries who were somewhat conservative. So I went as a seminarian.
How ecumenical of you, Father.
Yeah, isn't that wonderful?
Nothing if not.
So I went to talk with the Archbishop to ask him about what this possibility would be for these guys. And I said, would we accept them as priests? And he said that, well, the new rite of priestly ordination is doubtful because they've subtracted a word from the form. So he said that that's doubtful, and that the new rite of episcopal consecration is invalid because they've completely changed the form. So we would have to do something else with these fellows. So that was my impression. And as I eventually investigated these different matters to sort of find them out for myself. But then in the United States, at a certain point, there was a priest who had been ordained in the new rite who started to work with the Society of St. Pius X, Father Philip Stark. And he had been ordained in the new rite. And naturally, we found this quite disturbing because we were members of the same organization, sort of under the same roof, and this man was going around conferring sacraments that were doubtful, if not invalid. So we tried to raise the issue somewhat discreetly in theological articles in our magazine. Eventually, Archbishop Lefebvre told us that we really should not write about these issues, but we had to get to a point where we could tell our people that you can't go to this man's Mass. which we did. And that was extremely disturbing to us, and that became a major issue. One of the principal difficulties we had with Archbishop Lefebvre, and you can see in, again, with hindsight, if he is in the process of, in these years in the 80s, of making a deal under the table with the Vatican for recognition, he is not going to want someone in the organization to say that the rites that they use are doubtful or invalid. So this as well was a large issue that figured in our dispute with him.
Yes, and that came to a head when I had my final meeting with him in 1983, and I was with Father Schmittberger and him. And one of the objections that I brought up to him, Archbishop Lefebvre, was that he himself had said to me years before that the consecration of bishops in the Novus Ordo is invalid in his mind. And I said, how can we have anything to do with them if they have an invalid episcopacy? And he said, well, apparently it's valid, and pointed to Father Schmittberger, and he says yes, Father Schmittberger said, yes, it comes from the Eastern rites, so it's valid. So, I mean, that was the judgment, and, apparently it's valid, and Father Schmittberger says that it comes from the Eastern rites. Father Cekada
Schmittberger
pointed out...
Locuta S, then.
Right, with those two. Something that is of major, maximal concern to the Catholic Church, the validity of orders, and the episcopacy itself should be in the hands of, well, apparently it's right. It's all right, and yes, it comes from the Eastern Rite. And we find out from Father Cekada's research that it is an installation formula of a patriarch who has already been consecrated a bishop, and therefore it has nothing to do with conferring the fullness of the priesthood. But this was the cavalier attitude that was taken towards something of such great importance. But they had already decided that it was valid because they needed it to be valid in order to prepare themselves for the reconciliation with the modernists.
Well, and we talked about this before the show, about this being a perfect storm, really, and with all of these different things happening, you all realized that this was really the end. And so you started putting together the letter, which we still have today, I would say, is the charter of the issues that the society still faces. I think it was as valid then as it is now, and we've talked about some of those. I think we talked about pretty much all of the issues in the original letter. And I guess I would take us back to the spring 1983, because that's when the letter was in full composition, and Bishop Sanborn, you were working on that at the time, correct?
Yes, we all contributed. Then Father Kelly wrote the main draft of it, and we all, Father Cekada and I, contributed to it. What set it all off was that Father Thomas Zapp, who was ordained on November 3rd, 1982, he went to St. Mary's, Kansas, and there continued to use what he had learned in the seminary, and that was the pre-1955 rubrics. And he was told to say Mass for the nuns there, the SSPX nuns. Well, the nuns didn't like the fact that he was using that missal, so they complained to Switzerland that he was not using the right missal. And what came back was, either use the John the 23rd or else we'll kick you out. Now, when that came back, it was obvious that they had again dusted off the guillotine and were ready to do battle and really throw out anybody that was not going to change the missal and breviary. And so that changed the picture entirely. We saw that we were up against something very, very serious, and something had to be done. So it just changed us all completely. We had thought up to then that maybe we could live in peace with them, but it was not possible.
This made all of the issues sort of really coalesce, and the annulment, the liturgical changes, the the idea of the substitution of the ideas of Archbishop Lefebvre for those of the magisterium, the invalid ordination rights. And it all just really came together, and as you say, it really was a perfect storm from that point of view.
I should add to this little detail that when we were at the chapter, then Father Kelly and I, in 1982, Father Kelly, coming out of those discussions in the chapter, was so disgusted by the fact that they were so mixed up on theology and their attitude toward the Novus Ordo and the new religion that he wanted to quit there and then. And he said these people are all mixed up. They don't know what they think or what they're doing. And I talked him out of it. But he was ready to do it just to pack it in at that point. So, this was a building thing. I just add that as to show that it was a problem that was building up, and it just came to a head with the catalyst of the threat to throw out Father Zapp from the Society Symposium.
Well, now would be a good time to bring up about the meatloaf.
Well, I do want to talk about that, but I just want to linger for a moment on this issue because over the years the society has expelled almost as many priests as they've ordained, or expelled, or they've left. And my question is, they've accustomed lay people to the idea that you can just kick out a priest. If he's misbehaving, you can just kick him out, like firing an employee. And I wanted both Your Excellencies and Father, whoever would like to take the question, what is the Church's attitude towards just the simple expulsion of a incarnated or even just a titled priest?
Well, I mean, it's sort of like what the Church's attitude toward the bishop is who ordains a priest is sort of like a parent whose kid wants a puppy. They say, okay, that you insisted we get him, now you take care of him. Right. So the bishop has an obligation under church law, really toward the priests whom he ordains, and that's something that's very clear. And in the society, that was something that you simply never had. If you were out, you were out on the street. And even if you were someone with considerable problems, say psychological problems or anything like that, it really didn't make a lot of difference.
The relationship between a bishop of a diocese and his priest is contractual, in this sense that the bishop of the diocese must provide decent sustenance to the priest. That's in canon law. Mm-hmm. And the priest, in return, owes him obedience. And so decent sustenance means that you're going to make a pittance of a salary, really, if anything, but the bishop is obliged to support you for the rest of your life. Mm-hmm. With housing and transportation and all the other things that pertain to decent sustenance as it is defined in various regions of the world. But to throw out a priest after you have paid him, let's say, a pittance of a salary, maybe a few $1,000s a year, to throw him out at, let's say, age 50 without anything, it is a crime. It's a mortal sin to do that.
And I would add to that, Your Excellency, that not only that the regulation, strictly speaking, applies sure to the diocesan bishops primarily in terms of the contractual relationship and the obligation a priest has to obey his diocesan bishop, but also even any bishop, the law of the Church reads, any bishop really who ordains a priest, even illegally, has an obligation toward him as far as his sustenance goes. So that it even goes beyond that.
Yes, it is. There's a natural law there.
Yes.
To ordain a priest and just set him out to a pasture or drop him off at the edge of the road is against natural law. It's just not right. It's against the very nature of the Catholic Church to have priests running around looking for bread in waste paper baskets or trash cans. there is a natural contractual relationship there, and a natural care that is on the bishop. So to that practice of just kicking people out betrays the fact that they didn't see it as a true canonical situation. They saw it as a group of priests that were working together, and if you didn't work out, you got kicked out. It's something like a club or an association, or that wasn't really their minds concerning the nature of that society. Because if they had an idea of an obligation toward the priest, they would have gone through a trial and a proof that their contractual relationship was no longer obligatory, and given the priest an ability to respond.
Yes, and you could never have done something like an expulsion summarily like that in either a religious order or congregation or in a society of common life without vows, which they claim to be. It simply doesn't work that way. Difficulties like that are all governed by rules. And as Bishop Sanborn says, the fact that they acted so summarily really shows that they didn't take seriously the idea that they were, in fact, a society of the common life without vows. Otherwise, they would have had some rules like that.
And remember, all of this is because all of these priests, the hundreds of them, were unable to ride the wave. They weren't all of them really adept surfers. And you have to be able to catch the wave and ride the wave and stay with it when the society went this way or that way. It seems to me that analogy may have been used before, too.
Possibly, and you have to be careful because Frankie and Annette may be on the left, and who knows what's on the right.
Yes, you have to toe it. Yes.
I think, Your Excellency, that if the surfboard goes the wrong way, you end up with a vacant sea out in a vacant sea, if I'm not mistaken.
I believe
for those of you who are just joining us, it's a bit of inside baseball here at Clerical Conversations on the Crisis. If you're joining us today, if you're just joining us, we're with His Excellency Bishop Daniel Dolan, His Excellency Bishop Donald Sanborn, and Father Anthony Cekada, and we're discussing how we got to the 1983 crisis and their expulsions. And we're in the second hour of the show now, so if there are people who'd like to put questions to 3 of the 9, I suppose 1/3 of the group that was there, please feel free to call in. If you'd like to submit questions on Twitter, you can do so by going to our handle. If you go to Twitter and you type in @TrueRestoration and put in your question, it will come to us in our feed and we'll be able to ask it. In the meantime, while we're waiting for that, I'm sorry, go ahead, Father.
I was going to say that I assume that anyone with an Argentine accent goes to the top of the queue.
Yes, absolutely. We will take all Argentinian calls immediately. Or anyone who's choosing a first-time, never used before name.
Handle on Twitter, I think, yeah.
So 2 of you were in the room, and this is obviously a time before internet and tweets and text messages, so Bishop Sanborn, then Father Sanborn, was not at the location with you when the confrontation with the Archbishop happened, so he just had to wait it out until afterwards. But can we talk about how we got to having that meeting, and then just walk us through the meeting and what happened at that point?
Okay, so well, here's kind of what happened. So Bishop Sanborn, or rather Archbishop Lefebvre, came over to the United States with the idea of taking care of business, as it were, at the seminary, and removing Father Sanborn, installing Father Williamson, and seeing to it that his line was followed at the seminary. And his, obviously, from what had happened to Father Zapp, we could see the writing on the wall that the Archbishop was going to enforce his program and his ideas eventually on us as well. We had written him the letter with these different points, and we wanted to see some of these issues resolved by the Archbishop one way or another. Well, after the Archbishop removed Father Sanborn as rector of the seminary, he was just simply going to go. He wasn't going to come and see us down at Oyster Bay. But we insisted that he come down and see us because we wanted to talk about these issues. So on April 27th in 83, Archbishop Lefebvre came down to Oyster Bay Cove with Father Williamson, and then with Father Franz Schmidberger, who by that time was the Vicar General of the Society. He had, in effect, been elected to succeed Archbishop Lefebvre. So we went downstairs to a meeting room at Oyster Bay, and I passed out to the people present a list of the 6 resolutions that we had put as the practical conclusions of our letter to the Archbishop. And in the room that time, in addition to Father Schmidberger and the Archbishop and Father Williamson, it's myself, Father Kelly, Father Dolan, and Father Eugene Berry. So we started to discuss the different points in the letter. The Archbishop opened the discussion criticizing Father Zapp. I tried to pin the Archbishop down on the issue of ordaining priests who had been ordained in the new rite. We really didn't get anywhere with him. He said that the priest we were talking about, it would be better if he were ordained, et cetera, et cetera. But I pushed him to get a clear answer, and we really didn't get one. So we figured, well, then what about the John the 23rd liturgy? Well, we discussed that a little bit. He denied that the Society had permitted the use of the older missal before, which was false. It was in the Acts of the previous general chapter of the Society. And he got annoyed at us and said that we really didn't think with the Society. And Father Kelly and I then sort of went up a wall because the phrase really is the normal phrase that one uses is to think with the Church, with the mentality of the Church. And we got into the issue then of accepting the position of the Society. And then again there was a discussion of the John the 23rd liturgy, and Father Dolan had the discussion that he mentioned with the bishop about who gave you the authority to do it. So the discussion went around and around a little bit like that for a while, and I tried to move the discussion along a little bit further and to another point, and then the Archbishop noticed the last point that I had put on the paper, and this was the point that would deputize Father Kelly and I on behalf of the Society to draw up any legal documents that would bind corporations affiliated with the Society to observe the resolutions that we'd proposed. And so the Archbishop, seeing that, went through the roof. And because he realized that we were calling his bluff. And he said, this is useless, you're aggressive, take your liberty, I've had enough, go find a bishop, etc. Because what had happened, the reason we put that in, what had happened before is the Archbishop, being a diplomat, would tell you one thing at one time and another person the opposite thing at another time, trying, I suppose, to placate all parties. And for us, these issues of the new rite of ordination and marriage annulments were just simply too serious, that you couldn't go back and forth on it, and that we wanted a binding guarantee. And if he wasn't going to give it, well, that's just one of those things. So at that point, the meeting came to an end, and Father Schmidberger asked us about the whole question of the different properties in the churches, that we had, and he suggested we keep the news of the disagreement from the faithful. So as far as the whole issue of properties, we said that we weren't going to give any of them up, and that these issues were simply too serious for us. But we figured that maybe eating together would sort of bring down the level of tension a little bit, so we invited the Archbishop and Father Schmidberger and Bishop Williamson to have dinner with us, at least, because
you had precedent. You had precedent for this because Bishop Dolan had said that he had calmed down about an issue after he'd had a chance to sleep on it.
Yeah,
Exactly.
the scene in
but you
May
know what?
of 19...
I don't think it was calculated. I think we were just being polite. We were saying, look, it's rush hour. You'll get traffic on the Long Island Expressway. By the time you get back to Connecticut, it'll be very late. Why don't you have dinner with us? The meatloaf has already been prepared, and then that way you'll have your evening meal, and then you'll also avoid the rush hour. And Archbishop Lefebvre was interested in doing that, as we always say. I mean, who knows what would have happened?
Yeah, with him, sure.
Partaken of our meatloaf. But then what happened next, Father Cekada?
Well, what happened next is Bishop Williamson leaned over and said to Schmidberger in German that I don't want to eat with people like this. And so I said to Williamson in German, careful, you never know who else in the room understands German. So, but I did say later that, who knows actually what would have happened if we had dinner with Archbishop Lefebvre. But that was that, and they got up, and we accompanied him out to the parking lot and kissed his ring and thanked him and said goodbye to him. And we were under the impression from what Father Schmidberger said that we would sort of keep this all on the QT, and that our lawyers would try to negotiate it. We'd keep it all from the faithful for the sake of sparing them that. But then we heard that when they got back to the seminary, the first thing they did was to write a letter denouncing us to the people, and raising, of all things, the sede vacanti issue, which was absurd, because it had nothing to do with anything that we discussed.
Right.
So that's what happened at that point in April 1983.
And it's important to point out, too, that we were still sitting on those corporations as directors, and so it wasn't a question of keeping them out of something that they had legal title to or anything like that. We were sitting on those corporations, and we were not willing to resign from those corporations.
Yes, and in the finally, that when push came to shove, the overwhelming majority of the people who had in the congregations that had chapels supported us. They supported our stand, and saw what we were doing as something that was necessary to do for them too, because they had lost their churches to the Novus Ordo already one time before, and they didn't want it to happen again.
Well, I definitely want to continue talking about this. We've got a couple calls in queue. I just want to take one now while you finished your story, Father, and I think it's from Christian. Christian, go ahead with your question.
Oh, yes, hello. Hello, Excellencies, Bishop Sanborn and Bishop Dolan and Father Cekada. I have a question. What happened to the other 6 in the 9 that were expelled?
Well, let's see. Father Barry is saying Mass in Colorado, and
Aurora, Colorado.
Yes, and Bishop Kelly up in upstate New York, and then Father Collins is also in upstate New York at a different location. Let's see, Father Zapp is saying Mass in the San Francisco area of California and Modesto. Who else is there? Father Skirsky is saying Mass in Montana, and Father Jenkins in Cincinnati, Ohio.
So, Your Excellency, these individuals are still active in the ministry?
Oh, yes.
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I have another related question. The SSPX members who are expelled, do they look up to you guys for a job related duties or something?
Not yet. No one has come near us yet. No. You see, we are sedevacantist, so in the view of those in the society, we are like monsters. Because of the sedevacantist position, they when they leave, they don't understand that they should become sedevacantists. They still want to hold the inconsistent position of the Society of St. Pius X. So we are not an option for them thus far. Well, there was Father Abrahamovich. That might be one exception to that.
Yes, and then Father Neville too, right? And then
he resigned of his own accord, though. He was not kicked out.
Oh yes, that's right. Okay, sure. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Excellencies, and thank you, Father, for taking my call. Thank you, Stephen.
Thanks for your question. Well, I guess that let's go back to where we were. So Meatloaf refused. I guess he would do anything, but just not that. And then the court battles begin, and legal stuff is boring. Although I did find it fascinating that depositions were conducted at 666 Fifth Avenue. I couldn't believe that.
Cat's out of the bag. Wait till they hear about that one.
I'm also going to file that under my trash conspiracies hat. But anyway, the depositions go on, and I think Father Cekada has an article which you can find on traditionalmass.org, which is called We Resist You to Your Faith, in which a lot of this is detailed. But eventually the society loses, not only because of bad legal representation on their part, but because, as you said earlier, the faithful sided with you all, I suppose probably because you had catechized them well as to, what was going on and what was being resisted. And it wasn't a sedevacantist issue. You were resisting phony annulments, doubtful priests, doubtful sacraments, and an orientation of accommodation. I suppose the anti-accommodationists could be another name for the nine.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, in the question of the lawsuits, though, that it's not really a question of winning or losing. It's only the lawyers really who win on both sides. So it's a war of attrition. It's sort of like trench warfare conducted by snails, and it takes you forever to get through the legal system. And we explained this to Archbishop Lefebvre, that you just don't know the American legal system. We should come to some sort of an agreement. But he and his advisors had the idea that they were going to roll right over us. So it involved a whole series of lawsuits in different states. And there was one in federal court, the Southern District of New York. There was a lawsuit that was started by Lefebvre supporters in Virginia. There was another one in Eddystone, Pennsylvania. Eventually there was one in Minnesota. We instituted, as a way of pressure, a libel suit against them in the Southern District of New York, and then brought a suit against them in Connecticut. So there's all this stuff going on, and it ends up being like a war of attrition. So all of the higher-ups in the society at that point ended up having to come over to the United States and to give depositions and have their deposition is a testimony under oath. It's generally taken in a lawyer's office, and you're sworn in, and the lawyer for the opposing side asks you questions, and you have to answer the question. So this Archbishop Lefebvre had to do this several times. Bishop Williamson, Fillet did. All sorts of people had to do it and put in these different appearances. So what happened is we lost one suit. We kind of won another suit. Eventually what happened is we had been given some fairly good legal advice at the beginning of the lawsuits that told us of a way, if we wanted to, just to get everything dismissed in New York. And so, since it was a war of attrition, we went on for 4 years, and just before we were supposed to go to trial in New York, we filed a motion with this making this particular argument. And then at that point, the judge in New York had us into his court and had the society representatives into his court and said that, look, it's time that you really think seriously about settling this, because the argument that these priests, the 9, make is actually pretty good. I could throw this all out and you'd have to go and fight for another 4 years in different states. And then he said to us, on the other hand, you never know what's going to happen in my court. You know, I could award it all to them, so why don't we negotiate a deal? And so after 4 years in 1987, that's what happened. The judge had us into his chambers in the summer of 1987, starting appropriately enough on the 4th of July, as I recall. And we had our own fireworks, I guess, display in the judge's chambers. And eventually we did some horse trading and worked it out. They got some of the properties, we got others of the properties. We paid them a little money. In effect, we kind of paid them off. But by the same token, we were able to get some money back off the deal and actually get rid of 2 properties that turned out to be in bad neighborhoods. So, I mean, it was so that's how it ended up.
I think it's also important to note, Father, you can't really say that any properties were stolen when you've come to a legal settlement on the issue. You could say that prior to that, but if it's been settled, that means that's been settled. And so continuing to say that stuff was stolen is not only untrue, but just malicious, I think.
Yeah, first of all, they didn't own it anyway, and they hadn't given them money for it. So that's the first point. But the second thing is that when you sign an agreement like that you're going to take a certain amount of money for something to settle the dispute. I think it's called condonation. And then that's it. There's no question of theft or anything like that. So you've arrived at a negotiated settlement. So, you can't, they really can't say that.
It's like having your cake and eat it, too.
Yeah.
Well, if you can have your Pope and eat him, too, and so I can't have your cake. We have a question coming in from Twitter, a rather interesting stroke timely question.
Okay.
Would either Bishop Dolan or Bishop Sanborn be willing to ordain Pope Francis I as a true priest?
Well, I'd like to take
it would depend as to whether he would pass his Latin classes. That's for the first thing.
He would have to make an abjuration of heresy first before we could even consider it.
I hope that didn't come from a Vatican account.
Well, no, it doesn't say at as a gentleman named Mark. And Mark, I hope that answers your question. It would just depend on whether he would look at the true faith. And I think it's interesting. There's a lot of I don't want to talk too much about the topic. We'll talk about it another day. But this sort of hope that things would be different. It seems hope springs eternal, and that's something that's in the trad breast. But those of us who've been around long enough know that you don't just have sudden changes for no reason.
The problem is Vatican II. Even if he were wonderful on all other issues, the problem is Vatican II. And for as long as they adhere to Vatican II, the problem in the Church will continue.
Yeah. And this particular man, who I suppose we'll talk about at some point, seemed to have been, they say he was the main candidate against Ratzinger in the previous conclave. So, that makes one think that he has a little different take on the hermeneutic of continuity.
Yeah, he would need to be ordained a priest because he was ordained in the Novus Ordo rite in December of 1969.
Yes.
So that was not a vain question from Mark. It was a very good question.
Yeah. Yes, that's right.
Yeah,
sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Your Excellency and Your Excellency, I mentioned that we already know how Father Cekada would have done things differently because he happened to write an article on this subject a few years ago when I asked him to take a look at 25 years on. And Father, for those who hadn't read your article, you might recap about, as time goes on and as we all get a bit more mellow, that you had some changes as to what you would have done differently, and maybe you could share that with our listeners.
Well, Stephen's being ironic. It wasn't. I didn't mellow, I think, with age. I think that I said in the article that if I had it to do over again, I would have gone up to the seminary and changed the locks and locked Archbishop Lefebvre out and locked Williamson out, because it just gave them a basis in the United States for spreading the word about how it was acceptable to have doubtfully ordained priests work in your organization, and how it was acceptable to get modern annulments. So I think that instead of mellowing, I probably would have taken a harder line.
Your Excellency, Bishop Dolan, would you have done anything differently?
Exactly what Father Cekada said. That I can truthfully say that is my only regret, that we were not more aggressive before we were expelled, and that these things. But aside from that, everything I think was done that had to be done in order to maintain the integrity of the faith to the best of our ability.
Yes.
Bishop Sanborn?
Yes, clearly, looking in hindsight, we should have been more firm, more aggressive in protecting the Catholic faith from the corruption of being reconciled with modernists who are the worst heretics that ever have invaded the Church. And so, yes, we should have had more zeal and more firmness, and I agree with that.
Well, and all of you, this had a major effect in your life. You talked about the fact that once you finally left the organization, you were free of some of the neuroses of the organization. You were able to step back and look at some of these things objectively, and things became even clearer for you. So this was obviously a watershed moment for your priesthood. What do you think the effect was on people in the society, maybe people on the sidelines? If you looked at the people in your chapels, both at that time and as time has gone on, what was the when we look at the ripple effects, the concentric circles out from the splash? What are your reflections on those things?
Well, people go to church to go to Mass. The average person is relatively reluctant to get into big theological issues. They want to go to Mass. They want to solve their problem. The new Mass is bad. They know the traditional Mass is right, and that's where they want to be. So I think it was a hard burden on the people to have to go through all of this. And as it was on us, too. But I think the average layperson doesn't want to read a lot of tomes about theology in order to just practice his religion. But I think that they instinctively understood that it doesn't make any sense to be compromising with the very people that we're trying to flee from. I think they understood that very, very basically and instinctively.
Yeah, whenever we have these splits, I'm always conscious of that. You might say the scandal factor with the faithful, and it's hard for many people to understand. They are indeed scandalized, and you do lose some people because of that. And it's all very unfortunate that we have to go through this and do this. But in as much as we attempted to prepare the people by giving them a solid doctrinal formation in the real questions of the day, then most of the people indeed remained faithful, and the scandal was really not so bad. The scandal was really with Archbishop Lefebvre, that he was two popes or two men in one, and that was really that was the scandal.
Yes.
when I said earlier that I see the 1983 letter as a charter for what you were basing your resistance on, which was actual Catholicism, not a sort of sentimental negotiation with these pretended authorities, did this letter provide a springboard for other clergy, either Novus Ordo or traditional, to contact you, to ask you some of these questions about some of these points? And when you look at these points, have any of them changed for the better in the society over the years?
No, very, very little. We did our best to try to draw out some that would be of, let's say, good ideas in the Society of St. Pius X. I even started Sacerdotium, which was a quarterly journal for priests, with a lot of articles that would make them think, and it really had little effect. And the reason is that the priests in that group are incapable of thinking theologically. They are trained as goose steppers of the Society of St. Pius X, to follow the party line, to zig when it zigs and zag when it zags, flip when it flips and flop when it flops. And therefore, they're really not interested in what you're proposing. They are not capable of thinking on that level. It's all the Archbishop and what the prophet says. And so, I learned that early on. That there's really no independent thinking. Yeah, it's he is the prophet. He is the man sent by God to solve the problem in the church. That's all we have to worry about. And now the discussion is who is faithful to the prophet? Is it the strict observance people? Are they faithful to the prophet, or is it the reconciliationists? Are they faithful to the prophet? And by that I mean Archbishop Lefebvre. So you have this probable split in the Society of St. Pius X that's coming up. And now with this election of this new modernist pope, we'll see what happens. They'll probably approach this one and keep the comic opera going for another 10 or 20 years anyway.
Mm-hmm. The unfortunate thing is that there's always this appeal to the line of Archbishop Lefebvre, as if what he said was the ultimate criteria, that was the gold standard by which what you taught about the traditional Catholic faith was judged, and what your attitude toward the Vatican was. And the unfortunate thing is, you really see the discussion since the prospect of the split and disagreement within the Society of St. Pius X over the question of some sort of a regularization. You really see different schools of thought, but it all goes back to, they all appeal to Archbishop Lefebvre. And it was something, I suppose, that we had predicted all along. We talked about that if there would be a split in the Society of St. Pius X at any point, you would have one group and another group, both of which claim to be faithful to the inheritance of Archbishop Lefebvre. And unfortunately, that's just what you see. We wish it could be otherwise. We wish that they would get beyond that and start to look at the real theological issues, the nature of the authority of the Church. The Church can't give you something that's evil. The Church can't give you error in her universal ordinary magisterium. And get back to some solid, recognizable theological principles.
I think that you could say that all of our weal and all of our woe, all the good, all the bad, comes from Archbishop Lefebvre in so many senses. And both sides, of course, can perfectly well and accurately appeal to the spirit of the prophet, and that their half of the mantle has fallen on their shoulders and they're wearing it. The one thing that needs to be said, almost as a kind of a summing up, is that the one thing that we did not get from Archbishop Lefebvre was our Catholic faith. We received that at baptism. And sometimes you get the impression in the Lefebvrist circles that too must be ascribed to the prophetic archbishop. Well, that's not true. I was already Catholic. Father Sanborn was already Catholic. Father Kelly. We were Catholics when we went to Acon, and we wanted to be Catholic priests. That's why we went there. We didn't want to buy into this company of the prophet. That was something quite different. So because we had the Catholic faith, we received a Catholic ordination through Archbishop Lefebvre, and then we, as priests, have always worked to serve, to spread the Catholic faith, to save souls. That's always been our interest. And so therefore, naturally, we came to a parting of the ways a long time ago. Those who were interested in being followers of the Archbishop, quote unquote, are now picking and fighting over the bones like snarling dogs, and they're welcome to the carcass. We're not interested in that. We never have been. Thanks for that, right?
I had a discussion with some very intellectual priests, very, very well educated and sort of the cream of their crop, associated with the Society of Pius X back in the 1990s, and we had perhaps a 3-hour discussion about the church and how the position of the Society of St. Pius X is incompatible with the indefectibility of the Catholic Church. We went round and round and round on this, and I explained to them all of the traditional ecclesiology. Finally, at the end, one of them says to me, well, the traditional ecclesiology doesn't apply to the present situation in the Catholic Church. And after we've discussed it for 3 hours, and my mouth dropped. Well, what does? And so the other one said, well, you find a bishop in whom you have confidence and you follow him.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. And that said it all to me. I felt that they were defeated on the battlefield of the traditional theology, and that they had to concede at the end that really, all you do is follow the Archbishop.
Well, Bishop Dolan, you haven't. I've been interviewing Bishop Sanborn here on church history, and at table he corrected. I had misquoted Talleyrand, who had said they had remembered nothing, they had learned nothing and forgotten nothing, and it seems as though that probably applies best here to what you've been saying about.
There's another quote about Talleyrand from Napoleon, but that's not something we're going to cite right now. About the Pius X Society. We'll probably just let that one go. Although you're welcome to Google it if you'd like to, listening audience. That would pretty much sum up the society. Thanks. But go ahead.
Well, we have someone with us who I would say is from the old days, Dr. Carrion. Am I pronouncing that correctly, sir?
Yes, that's correct.
I do have a question. Go ahead.
Yes, well, I just wanted to comment that I have very subtle memories, of course, with the Father Dolan and Father Sanborn before they became bishops, and it was in connection with the Emperor Proud Church in Bay City. And it was the most embarrassing moment when Father Sanborn came to me and asked if he could say Mass at the Emperor Proud Church. Here I was, a layperson, with the embarrassing situation to give permission or not from the same Mass. And I don't think I ever want to be in that situation again. And I'm glad that, as history has it, that both he and Father Dolan are now bishops, and I look forward to the future with them. And I just want to thank both of them for what they have done.
Oh, thank you, Dr.
Thanks, Doctor. Good. And I just have one obvious question. If it is at all possible, your phone interview is our internet interview is at the same time as presumably Pope Francis has been made a pope, and I just was wondering very quickly where are we at with him?
I don't know much about him. I don't know if anybody else knows much about him either. Does any?
He's a
Communion and
Jesuit
Liberation
from
man.
Argentina.
Yes. He's a Jesuit. One of those so-called pastoral popes, I'm sure, but a product of the new church, 100%.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
He's the new church with the smiley
and
face.
Dr. Carrion, we're going to have a show. We're going to have a full-length show on this new claimant in the next few days, hopefully, just depending on everybody's schedule. So.
Well, I appreciate it, Father Cekada sent me another email because I've been looking forward to these internet discussions.
Oh, thank you.
Well,
Thanks very much.
Thank you. Good day.
Bye.
Well, I guess that's a blast from the past there. Commending your work. For those of you who are just joining us, we are talking today with His Excellency Bishop Daniel Dolan, His Excellency Bishop Donald Sanborn, and Father Anthony Cekada on the inaugural episode of Clerical Conversations on the Crisis, a hopefully monthly show which will discuss certain matters, specifically about the post-Vatican II epoch. And with that, anything further? I know we were last talking about what would happen with the various faithful, and we just heard from one who was there at the time, and we talked about the fact that people who, even if they go to have a discussion with Bishop Sanborn at the end, they still can't admit what's staring them in the face. Do you have any further reflections on this time period, on this event in your life, and how it has guided your priesthood or will continue to guide you in the future?
Well, on the question of you mean of the dispute of the Nine in 1983? Yeah, on that specifically, yeah. It did have, I think, some very long-term effects that are still with us as a result of this, because we were able to maintain our priestly ministries in most of the places that we've been conducting them before the break with Archbishop Lefebvre, and strengthen these different institutions and build up new institutions, so that the people who, so that if you look in terms of where Sedevacantism is in different parts of the world, America is absolutely the stronghold for it. And the number of mass centers between our groups and other Sedevacantist groups, we have perhaps 90 mass centers in several schools and seminaries and so on. So the getting out of the orbit of the Society of St. Pius X and operating according to consistent principles, I think allowed us to establish, all of these different apostolates in this country, and certainly this is good for the people and good for the future of the Church as well. And as a result of the dispute, obviously people became aware of these issues.
I would like to say, I can't speak for the others, but I'd just like to say that, we've said a lot of negative things about Archbishop Lefebvre today, but there is much positive about him too, and he has to be commended for his good side and his courage and his strength and abilities in setting up a seminary and going through all of the trouble that he did in order to try to train traditional priests. You can never take that from him. I mean,
sure.
It was unfortunate that he was mixed up in his own mind as to how to treat the Novus Ordo, but that doesn't. None of us would be priests except for him, and so we have to recognize that fact, that despite his faults, that he did contribute a great deal to what we are doing today.
Yes,
and then furthermore, you'd have to say that I think that one could say he was a very fatherly man. He was a very kind man, and he was a very patient man as well as a diplomat. And in his own personal life, as a bishop, extremely edifying, very holy and a saintly life. Certainly, was the life that he led. It's a real tragedy that this group that he established ended up being just so mixed up, so unpleasant, so full of weird people and weird ideas, and it's caused so much grief to the Church. Because you put that alongside of all these positive and true things that we were saying about the memory of Archbishop Lefebvre now, it's difficult to compute the two of them together. But that's the tragedy, you might say, of what we're talking about in our radio show this afternoon.
Sure, and one realizes this, of course, as one gets older, and one's physical capacities start to slide a little bit. I mean, he conducted this tremendous worldwide apostolate to keep things going, and traveled all over the world to all the continents and everything to try to promote the Catholic faith. And that certainly was very, very edifying and very heroic, and it certainly kept the visibility of the resistance to the Catholic faith, to the modernist faith, on the part of true Catholics, very much in the forefront. So that was the sacrifices he made there were certainly really astounding.
And I think in his heart, if we set aside his diplomacy, I think in his heart he was a dyed-in-the-wool anti-modernist. And left to his own inclinations of his heart and mind, he would have proceeded well and would have had all the right ideas and made all the right decisions. But that diplomatic side and that idea to somehow reconcile with the modernists ruined, I think, all of that good that was in both his mind and his heart.
Yes. And then I think, as long as we're speculating now, I think it might be accurate to say as well, the whole question of his entourage surrounded by these young priests who perhaps had their own agendas and who certainly influenced him to a large measure to move in these confusing and illogical directions. That would play a large part in the explanation. How did that happen?
Yes.
Well, and the entourage is still around, wielding the levers of power, as far as I know.
Well, not all of them. Some of them have been shut out of the power structure now, which is, of course, exactly what's going to happen. So somehow you're moving from a cone to the Kremlin in about 30 seconds here. Interesting.
Well, again, if you're joining us, we're at the very end of our show today, the inaugural show of Clerical Conversations on the Crisis. We have been joined by His Excellency Bishop Daniel Dolan, His Excellency Bishop Donald Sanborn, and Father Anthony Cekada, 3 of the 9 priests, at the time they were priests, who were expelled from the Society of St. Pius X in 1983 over disputes about how to deal with the crisis, specifically position towards the modernist Vatican, the conciliar religion, as the Archbishop would sometimes call it, when he was upset. And if you are joining us now, in a few minutes the show will wrap, and you can simply go and download our show and listen to it from the beginning. As mentioned through the show, we are hoping to have a show, it's going to be part 3 of the Restoration radio series on the legacy of Benedict XVI, which is obviously one of his legacies is who the next pontiff, at least the claimant to the papacy, would be. And we'll try to do that show the next few days. I just would urge our listeners to be patient. You have to keep in mind that all of the clerics involved are very busy, and it's always a real blessing to have them on. And so, as always, I thank Your Excellencies and Father so much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you.
So we'll go out with Dies Irae, I suppose, and we hope that you'll join us next time. Thank you again, Your Excellencies, for joining us, and Father.
Thank you, Steve. Bye.
This program was brought to you free of charge by the sponsorship of Novus Ordo Watch. See for yourself that the Church of the Second Vatican Council is not in fact the Catholic Church of the ages. Go to novusordowatch.org. That's novusordowatch.org.